Let's be clear. Multiple representation is generally not advised. It inherently compromises your ability to effectively represent your client's best interests, and it exposes you and your brokerage to unnecessary liability. That being said, you need to know how to identify multiple representation, how to avoid it, and what mandatory obligations you must fulfill when it simply can't be avoided. In this video, we will define multiple representation, review the circumstances where multiple representation can occur, discuss the significant risks and limitations on your service, review the required disclosures and consent forms. Let's get started. What is multiple representation? Multiple representation arises when a designated agent or brokerage represents multiple clients with competing interests in the same real estate transaction. This practice immediately creates a conflict of interest, as you are responsible for advocating for the best interests of all clients, and those interests are inherently at odds. When does multiple representation occur? To understand when multiple representation occurs, we must distinguish between two types of representation: brokerage representation and designated representation. Under brokerage representation, the entire brokerage and all of its agents are bound by the same duties to the client. This means that every agent must work in the best interest of every client of the brokerage. So under brokerage representation, multiple representation occurs when the same brokerage represents a buyer and a seller, or two competing buyers in the same transaction. And we can compare that to designated representation. Now, this is the model introduced by Tressa. The brokerage assigns a specific agent to represent the client. That designated agent is responsible for acting in the client's best interests. Under designated representation, multiple representation can still occur when a single agent is the designated representative for both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, or for multiple competing buyers for the same property. Multiple representation severely compromises your ability to provide full service to your clients. In normal designated representation scenarios, you're responsible for acting in the best interests of your clients. But under multiple representation, because you are serving two clients with competing interests, you must act objectively and impartially. And because of this, there are significant limitations on the services that you can offer. You cannot disclose the price that each party is willing to pay or accept. You cannot disclose the motivation of either client, for example, their urgency to buy or sell, and you cannot disclose the terms of other offers. For example, if you represent both the buyer and the seller, you would know the buyer's highest price and the seller's lowest acceptable price. But in this scenario, you cannot reveal this information to either client, nor can you provide guidance on pricing that would compromise this knowledge. This is a severe limitation on the service that you can offer. In a multiple representation transaction, you must exercise extreme caution, ensuring that both clients are aware of these risks and that you treat their competing interests in an objective and impartial manner. So what should you do when considering multiple representation? When a non-client requests you to engage in a situation that would result in multiple representation, your first step should always be to offer alternatives. So straight away, provide the RICO guide. Give the party the mandatory RICO guide and explain it in detail. Encourage independent representation. Explain the benefits of designated representation and strongly encourage them to obtain their own designated representative. Explain self-representation. If they refuse independent representation, then self-representation is an option. In this scenario, you provide full services to your existing client and only provide factual, limited services or assistance to the self-represented party. And you should know that this option comes with its own risks and limitations, so make sure to check out our video on self-represented parties and required disclosures. And finally, explain multiple representation and its risks. So you should only consider proceeding with multiple representation as a last resort. And if you do, you need to clearly explain what it means, and that it means that you must act impartially and you cannot divulge confidential information like pricing or motivation. If, after these discussions, you decide to proceed with multiple representation, you must complete these steps and obtain consent as soon as you know that multiple representation will occur. You cannot proceed until they are complete. Number 1, determine any property interests. You must not proceed if you or anyone in your immediate family owns the property or will personally benefit from its sale. Multiple representation is expressly forbidden in this scenario. Obtain existing client consent. Discuss multiple representation with your existing client and obtain their consent. Review the RICO guide again. Ensure that they understand that your relationship and the information you can provide will significantly change, because going forward you will be required to act objectively. And remember, they're not obligated to proceed in a multiple representation scenario. Recommend independent legal advice. You cannot advise clients on whether multiple representation is in their best interest. So you must advise both parties to obtain legal representation before proceeding to ensure that they fully understand the implications. And finally, obtain all signed disclosures. Get both parties to sign the RICO guide, if not already done, and complete the mandatory multiple representation disclosure forms. Now let's take a look at actually completing these disclosure forms. When you're working on a transaction involving multiple representation, one of your obligations is to provide the client the necessary disclosure forms. For buyer clients, use Form 326. That's the multiple representation, buyer acknowledgement and consent disclosure. At the top, enter the buyer's name, your brokerage name, and the property address. Then have the buyer initial the bubble that fits your specific situation. Let's break down the 4 options. Number 1, multiple representation and brokerage representation. This applies when a brokerage operates under a brokerage representation model. And remember, in this model, every agent is assumed to have knowledge of every client. If the brokerage represents both the buyer and seller, even with 2 different agents, it's multiple representation. And note that since Zolo operates under designated representation, you probably won't use this very often. The second option is multiple representation and designated representation. This occurs when a brokerage operates under designated representation, and that means that they assign a specific agent to a specific client. Under this model, you are required to maintain confidentiality and to act in the best interest of your client. However, if you are the designated representative for both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, you would enter into multiple representation and you must initial this bubble. The third option is multiple representation and designated representation and brokerage representation. This sounds like a mouthful, but basically this applies when one party is under designated representation and the other is under brokerage representation. For example, if you are the designated representative of the buyer, but the seller is being represented by the brokerage as a whole without a specific designated agent, then you would initial this bubble. And finally, option 4 is multiple representation and competing buyers. You would have your client initial here when you are the designated representative for multiple buyers competing for the same property. So once that's complete, you would then use the comment section to clarify any unique details about your representation. Have the buyer initial the final bubble to confirm their consent to the multiple representation. And finally, sign the bottom yourself and have your buyer sign as well. Now, Form 325 is for the seller client, and it's nearly identical to Form 326 with only one key difference. There's no bubble for competing buyers. Since competing buyers only impacts the buyer side, that option is omitted. Otherwise, fill it out exactly as we did with Form 326 for the buyer client. In summary, you should always make every effort to avoid multiple representation. These transactions expose you to unnecessary risk and inherently compromise your professional ability to act as a full advocate for your client. If you must proceed with multiple representation, remember the key takeaways. Always recommend legal counsel, explain the risks and service limitations, and obtain all required disclosures before moving forward with the transaction.